cult. What's it like to be a follower of David Koresh?
These people perceive themselves as the true saints of God.
This child and her mother were in the cult, where suicide was taught.
You were supposed to use cyanide or use a gun and stick it in your mouth. Because if you didn't, and if you stuck it to your temple, you might survive.
But her father got her out. David Koresh was going to make her his bride.
He was God, you know. What he says goes.
Deborah Roberts reports from Waco, Texas, inside the cult.
Then, higher education, the great American dream. What's compound? But in what could lead to a resolution, the FBI said today that negotiators have at last met face-to-face with some of Koresh's deputies. And one agent said he felt the cult members were glad the meeting took place. Later in the hour, we'll get an update from Waco. But we begin with a look at how the man who believes he's the Messiah brought all this about.
Over the past 10 days, Dateline has been piecing together accounts from some of Koresh's former followers, including a young girl whose father managed to get her out of the cult. And we've talked to authorities who met Koresh some years back. Deborah Roberts has our report. The first voice you're about to hear is the man we know as David Koresh.
That song was written and recorded 6 years ago by Vernon Howell, the 33-year-old high school dropout now called David Koresh. In the aftermath of the shootout 17 days ago that left 4 federal agents dead, his words about a rival leader seem oddly prophetic. In the days since the bloody raid on the Branch Davidian compound, many have been asking, who is David Koresh? And how could he and his supporters outgun federal agents? Especially since investigators had known about the group's practices for years.
It appears that David Koresh did slip through the cracks.
Denise Wilkerson was an assistant district attorney in Waco, Texas in 1988. She got an early look at the cult leader as part of a prosecution team which tried Koresh for attempted murder. In a 1987 gun battle, he'd taken control of the Waco Branch Davidian compound and installed himself as the group's leader.
I was convinced that he was a dangerous man.
But the jury wasn't, despite evidence that Koresh and his followers invaded the rural compound. Some jurors later said they couldn't believe such a peaceful-looking man could be dangerous. The charges were dropped. You saw evidence of the weapons that he was accumulating at the time.
That's correct.
But you gave them all back.
We didn't have any choice in the matter. And there was no legal authority for us to keep the weapons at that time. We reported the purchase of these weapons to the federal authorities because we were looking to see if there might have been any other kinds of violations.
What did you make of the Branch Davidians?
Well, we described them more as a paramilitary organization. The patrols, the sentry, the watchtower.
Despite the concerns of local prosecutors, federal authorities took no action. Koresh was free to build both his cult and his arsenal.
Well, at the end, you were supposed to be killed with the guns, and then you were going to come back as, you know, an immortal.
12-year-old Curie Jewell was raised in the cult by her mother after her parents divorced. Last February, her father David went to court to get her out of the group. He says he once talked to the man who just 2 years ago changed his name to David Koresh.
I was on the phone with him for 20 minutes. I asked him about how he could believe some of the things that he believed and how could he teach certain things. And I have to tell you that at the end of that 20 minutes, I was questioning what I believed.
He's that good.
He's that good. If he could do that to me in 20 minutes, over the telephone, I cannot imagine the kind of control and total influence that he has over the people who are there now, who have willfully subjected themselves to him 24 hours a day. Their allegiance is unquestionable, I'm sure.
Former members say that life in the group revolved around lectures led by Koresh, who at first claimed to be a prophet and now calls himself the Messiah.
You need to come over and join us?
Curie Jewell says her mother is more than a true believer. She's one of Koresh's many wives. Sherry Jewell was with the Waco Branch Davidians when federal agents stormed the compound February 28th.
I knew it was going to happen. You were just, before it happened, you were just waiting.
You knew there would be some kind of a bloody battle out there. How did you know that?
Oh, he talked about it. He set it out and how it would go.
What did he say?
Oh, that the feds are going to get him and they're going to have a shootout. That was about it.
While federal officials had been told about the group's weapons during Koresh's 1988 trial, the first real look inside the Waco branch Davidians came during Curie Jewell's custody hearing last year. Witnesses revealed that this splinter group of the Seventh-day Adventists had slowly been transformed into a cult centered around David Koresh.
Well, a lot of it was fear.
This videotaped courtroom testimony and affidavits from former cult members describe a man who could quote scripture from memory and who controlled his followers through physical, mental, and sexual abuse.
You're telling me that he was commenting on her sexual anatomy while she and her daughter were both present?
Oh, yeah.
By the time of the custody hearing, David Jewell says he had been tracking the group for 8 months. He says he began his investigation after a phone call from a former cult member.
He introduced himself and told me that he had been a member of this group and that he was very concerned for the safety of my daughter. And at that point, he had my full attention. And then he asked me if Curie had worn a pendant. And I said, yeah. So he told me that the pendant was worn only by very special people in the group and that it was an indication that she had been chosen to become one of Vernon's wives.
Did you feel Curie was in danger when you heard that she was marked as a special girl within the group?
No, absolutely. She was at that time 10 years old, and there was question at that time whether she had been selected to become one of his wives or whether she in fact was one of his wives, and all that implies.
You knew you were going to be one of the wives. What'd you think about that?
It was a great pleasure. I mean, it was an honor.
So you look forward to that?
I think I was more scared of it than anything.
And it was her father's fears that led him to turn over his information to authorities, information that pointed to an even darker side of the cult leader.
I gathered a large battery of information in forms of sworn affidavits from former followers, and the abuses that were listed there were unfathomable. One story always comes immediately to mind about an 8-month-old baby. And Vernon brought it up in front of the group and he spanked this child for 40 minutes. And the mother gave me a statement that said that when she got her baby back, its buttocks were bruised and bleeding. This was an 8-month-old child.
Why won't you call him David Koresh?
They believe that Christ, when he comes back to this earth, will use the name David. And the word Koresh goes back to the Hebrew name for an ancient king, Cyrus, who in the Bible was known for the destruction of Babylon. So when you extend that out, David Koresh actually means Christ, the destroyer of Babylon. And that's not a term that I'm willing to give him.
Despite repeated warnings over the past year, authorities took no action as Koresh's personal cult of the Messiah seemed to be heading for its own judgment day. Curie says even the children were being prepared for suicide.
You were supposed to use cyanide or use a gun and stick it in your mouth, because if you didn't, and if you stuck it to your temple, you might survive.
So he was teaching you the right way to commit suicide?
Yeah.
What did you think about that?
He was God, you know. What he says goes.
Throughout discussions with Koresh, he has indicated he has been prepared for this confrontation since 1985.
At the daily press briefings in Waco over the past 2.5 weeks, federal officials offered contrasting views of David Koresh. Rational one day, stubborn the next. As the siege wore on, the government often seemed as surprised as the media.
Weapons, there may be explosives and perhaps even rockets within the compound.
But federal authorities shouldn't have been surprised. David Jewell's information only added to what they had already known for 5 years.
I talked to the FBI, I mean, those efforts were frustrating.
Did you feel like anybody was listening?
No. And those who were willing to listen, the message that I got was, yeah, well, we believe you, but there just really isn't too much that we can do about it.
Our office didn't turn a deaf ear, and that's why we were there. I can't speak for other federal agencies that might have been contacted.
Stephen Higgins heads the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. 4 of his agents were killed during the raid on the cult.
I'm not going to say to you now that we can't learn from this or that we didn't do things that we would do differently.
Did the ATF ignore warnings, early warnings about the danger at the compound?
I don't believe so, and I don't think that anything that anybody has shown to this point, any facts that have been shown to this point would establish that.
The administration of the ATF who gathered intelligence and who planned that raid were negligent.
Mark Bunns was born into the Waco branch Davidians in 1960. He left before David Koresh took control.
And I was actually baptized into it.
Right here in this stream?
Right here in this stream.
In your mind, could this standoff have been prevented?
I believe it could have. I think it was just horrible that, you know, they should lose so many people and then try to negotiate peacefully.
Did Howell create the cult, or did the cult create him?
Vernon Howell is almost as much a victim in this thing as the people who follow him. He did not just step up to the plate and say, hello there, I'm your savior. They fed his ego. They put him in the position to take power. I believe they created a monster and it got away from him.
And if the so-called monster got away from the Waco branch Davidians, he also got away from the authorities. Just a week before the ATF's tragic attempt to take the cult by force, David and Kiri Jules say they were brought to Waco to meet state and federal investigators and to discuss the case against David Koresh. How do you feel about David Koresh?
Intense anger. It's bad enough for the people who have chosen to stay there with him and to support him. But he willfully turned their lives inside out. He plotted to take them away from their sanity and to entrap them in his madness. And that's inexcusable.
So it was no secret that these branch Davidians had a lot of guns, even an arsenal of weapons. But that's not illegal in Texas?
Not necessarily, or throughout most of the country. In fact, they're known to have a .50 caliber machine gun inside the compound.
And that's not illegal?
It's not illegal as long as there's nothing in your background that, say, perhaps is a criminal record to prohibit that. Owning a large number of guns is not illegal.
What brought the federal authorities into the case then finally?
The ATF says last year it got evidence that David Koresh and his followers were actually starting to convert some of their legal weapons into illegal automatic weapons. Then that becomes a concern for them, which is why they conducted the raid.
All right, thank you, Deborah.
Well, coming up, are college students getting...
Seems to be getting weaker. What do you know about that?
That's right, Jane. The FBI says that even Koresh now admits that he's too sick to move. Those were the words they used in quoting him because of his gunshot wounds. They don't know exactly the nature of the wounds, although he has complained for some time about a wound in the side and one in the arm.
Do they have any sense that these wounds are or are not life-threatening?
They don't believe they're life-threatening for now, but of course the big question is infection and the onset of infection. So that means that in the face-to-face negotiations that they've had for the first time yesterday, Wayne Martin, a Harvard-educated lawyer in there, and Steve Schneider, who is Koresh's #2 man, have met with government negotiators. And what's significant here is that the government negotiators included somebody from the federal government, but more importantly, the local sheriff, who is somebody the people inside the compound trust.
With Koresh getting weaker, perhaps because of these wounds, does that imply to authorities that the standoff could be coming to an end?
It does imply that because the authorities believe the one thing they have on their side is time. They have cut off the electricity in there, they have set up floodlights at night, and these people in there, even though they have an ample supply of food and water, many of them have suffered gunshot wounds, many of them have gotten ill. It gets cold here at night, it gets very hot here during the day, the conditions cannot be very comfortable, and the authorities really feel now that there are moves in the positive direction.
There have been adults, some few, who have come out, Jim. Will they ever be allowed access to the media for interviews as to what's been going on inside?
Interesting question, because today, Kathy Schroeder, the woman who came out last Friday because she wanted to be with one of her children, was in court. She's being held without bond as a material witness, and she asked a federal magistrate to let her go. Tomorrow he's going to rule on that, and if he does let Kathy Schroeder go, she has said she's going to talk to anybody and everybody about what conditions are like inside the compound.
All right, thanks, Jen. We'll monitor the story as events warrant. We'll be back after this.